constantly running around with your hair on fire and curious as to how slowing down can actually impact performance, decision making, and how you prioritize, then you'll want to tune into this episode. Cover a variety of topics with my guest, including that piece, but also things like how employers can reimagine the future working relationships so that when it comes to an employer/employee relationship, it's more so a dating vibe versus an arranged marriage vibe. Let's dive in. Welcome back to another episode of The Leader Within. Today, I'm excited to introduce Sabrina Sullivan, a strategic foresight and partnerships lead and founder of Buy and Buy. She has extensive experience in leadership and in equipping individuals and organizations with the foresight, tools, and strategies to confidently navigate their future, ensuring that they're not just reactive, but proactively shaping their tomorrow. And that is why I'm excited to have her share her insights with you. Well, welcome, Sabrina. Can you share with us a story that has shaped the trajectory of your career?
Yeah, I did not really know foresight was a thing. I started as a strategy and operations consultant in Deloitte, have done a couple other random things, but when I took a break from consulting and said I was going to become a recovering consultant and I went back to school, I went back to do my master's of science and I did an MBA, and I was curious going into it. I was just going to reap the benefits of sort of diligent business rigor and whatever from the US schooling system. And within a very short amount of time, I had a professor reach out to a number of us grad students to put together COP17 scenarios for a large professional services firm. And one, I didn't know that people were focused on this or that actually gave the time to think into the future, because often I was thinking 1 to 2 years. This was pushing out 10 to 15 years. And with that really unlocked a gap that I saw in the rest of my business education, but also a real opportunity to activate that other side of myself that I always felt was not always welcome in the business world, which was imagination and creativity and thinking of things in complex systems that you can start to bring down. And so foresight became my own passion to see where and how we integrate that into our work. Strategic foresight is really not about getting it right in any sort of sense. It's where you learn really active forecasting. A lot of people have a lot of rigor in that. Strategic foresight is not about getting it right. It's about how do we explore multiple futures, examining those emerging trends and uncertainties, some of those things that we feel like may never come to pass, but are a possibility or a plausibility. And then this approach then helps organizations and leaders prepare for various plausible scenarios and really fostering that sort of resilience and adaptability. And to me, it fosters the ability to actually be a leader and be bold and start to move in that direction, which is what gets me excited. It's not a risk measure. It's how do you actually turn it into an opportunity? But we don't take the time to push ourselves to that long term, or we don't have the luxury sometimes when we're looking for immediate needs, immediate actions, immediate decisions. Often people aren't giving themselves the time to even make the exercise of thinking about these multiple scenarios. They just want to know what is exactly going to happen.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing that story. And I remember listening to a podcast episode where they were talking about how strategic planning prior to the pandemic looked significantly different than with the whole world events between 2020 to 2022, right? Just because a lot more organizations had to be agile, right? So how does as you the work that you do as a foresight strategist kind of go hand in hand with the way that strategy has shifted and approach in the last couple of years?
Yeah. So first off, I would say that strategy is definitely recognized, that long-term thinking is a critical piece to it. I'm actually not convinced people have transformed their strategic planning process to accommodate it. There might be an element of how do you use foresight to do risk planning. So they'll look at some of those wild card activities or those sort of big disruption elements to make sure that their strategies are at least considering some of those, but not necessarily recognize the value of where foresight can transform it and how it can actually provide differentiated value in it. And in that case, it's because there's so much change that people haven't cracked the strategy sort of approach to rethink how does the long term really build into it? How are we not viewing this as necessarily like a linear process? How are we starting to collate from an element of like, we aren't the experts on all of this, and we just have to pull wisdom from everywhere And I could go on for days, but like the last biggest thing is recognizing that uncertainty is inherent, and uncertainty is going to be a growing percentage of what you have to manage. And that I have not seen in a lot of groups, and it's depending a number of factors, but I think some has changed, but I don't think people have figured out or dedicated the time to be able to actually sort of reorient their processes for it.
Okay, and speaking of dedicating their time, like for those who aren't used to strategy, because like sometimes people think they're like, I'm being strategic right now, right? And then it's actually no, you're not actually strategizing.
You're doing planning. Yeah,
exactly. So can you tell us a little bit about the difference between planning versus that strategy piece? And we'll start there.
Yeah. So I view it, there's, if anyone wants to dig into sort of like a nerdy deep dive, there's a futures cone that goes from like just operations to planning to strategy to vision to transformation. And with those, there's not only like a time horizon that goes to it, but I believe it's different for every organization. So a CPG organization that's pushing out granola bars is going to be very different than a larger industrial utility company in terms of their time horizon. But let's say like 3 to 5 years. There's the time horizon, and then there's the level of uncertain data that and sort of uncertainty that goes along this. Those are key pieces that I think people need to differentiate between, because planning a 1-year strategy, that's a plan. You have to put further out to say, like, these are the strategic questions, because there's a level of uncertainty that you have to accommodate and manage at that horizon. But like I said, then you go potentially 5 to 7 years and you talk vision. And when you go further out, that's transformation. That's when you're really thinking about that sort of piece. And there are different people in the organization. But those are two ways that I think you can think about the difference, is that there's a lot less certain data and it's a longer time horizon for strategy.
I love that visual. And so for those who have never been in a position who can develop strategies and stuff like that, like are there certain frameworks of thinking that can help those individuals start to develop that muscle, so as they prepare for more strategic roles or leadership roles that require that skill, that they have like some sort of framework that they can operate off of?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that we joke that is like tips of how to think like a futurist. And the first one is you have to start outside in versus inside out. And that already builds a muscle around recognizing the inherent set of conditions and situations that you have absolutely no control over. And so you have to think of the global context, and then you kind of cascade down to your sector before you think about yourself. And another way to think about that is beware of the SWOT. And I'm sure there are business schools and schools around the world that are hearing this and going, wait, what? And it's because to take that sort of high self-orientation view, you miss a lot of those things because you assume that you can control things. So taking that outside in perspective, and then recognizing that there are outliers. So giving yourself dedicated time to that sort of level of fringe that exists out there, and not being a skeptic about it, but rather saying, like, if this was to come to pass, and it doesn't have to be a large research project, you read something, you think and start to think about implications of that and making that part of your daily practice. And then on a larger side, it's, to me, in the strategy, it's scenario planning. And scenario planning, not just to test your strategy, it's really, I call it like the concurrent, and the post foresight. There's a role in all of those things for a level of scenario planning that inherently recognize that there are multiple futures that will exist. And every time I go through it, there's always a couple leaders that challenge me and say, well, do you actually believe that this world is going to come to pass? And my answer is always, this world in its sort of discrete description is not going to come to pass, but elements of all of these different worlds are going to come to pass. So we have to exercise through all of them to understand what no regret moves exist, what sort of optionality we're going to take, and then the signposts of some large impact disruptors that we're going to track and know when we need to pivot, because, something can't live on a paper. Nothing ever turns out the way that we've really mapped it out. Anyone that's done like a process diagram, it's like, this is how it's supposed to go. But does it really go that way? Likely not.
Well, as you share about that, I'm curious, like as an entrepreneur, like what would you say is like your biggest barrier to entry when it comes to helping leaders and boards see the value in the work that you're doing? Because it's like, as you're chatting through this, I'm like, it makes a lot of sense, but because most
Mm-hmm.
businesses are so caught up in the day to day and being really reactive with what's going on, that they don't always create the space for like realizing the value of what you do. So yeah, can you touch about like potentially one of the biggest barriers that you've had to kind of overcome to kind of help leaders realize the value of the work that you do?
It's the time deficit that everyone has constructed in some sort of way in the systems we've put around it. And so there are so many organizations that they may judge the leader because they don't have time for this. But if you look at the full scope of what we've built, the span of control that they have, how many people they need to look at, how many initiatives they have going on, a struggle to justify how do I not thin slice my day? Because these conversations around foresight, sure, they might take more time. So it might take a week that we're investing in this time. But that sort of slow thinking then has changed mindsets. It's forced you to see things that you never had seen before, and you can't unsee that. You can't unring that bell in some sort of way. But it creates a framework. It creates some of those heuristics that if we don't have the time to do it, we're just operating in a panic mode. I describe it as like, do we want to be firefighters, or are we actually doing some like prevention? So we could talk preventative health versus sort of acute care of what we want to try to do. This is that preventative health. And when have we ever seen someone who hasn't taken some level of preventative health measures succeed? Like we're going to see larger issues with the body, those sort of things. I could always use an analogy on it. But to me, we're not dedicating the opportunity and the time. Foresight-driven companies, there's been research done that like they see 33% more profitability. Their market cap can be 200% greater for those foresight-led companies. But it's a trade-off because you're not necessarily going to just be churning through things in the short term. There's such a short-term pressure, and everyone's relied on to be an expert right now. It's a lot of load on leaders, right?
Yeah, I can appreciate the load that is on their shoulders and on their plate right now. And I'm curious, like for yourself, like are there larger behavioral changes that need to happen within an organization to continue to reinforce foresight-led companies, or what does that actually look like?
Yeah, it comes back to what you said, like people need to believe in it and see the value to be able to shift their behaviors. And so my approach is always like, I can talk for days about the value of it, but I spend a lot of time driving actionable strategies so people can see it. And so it's not just a research effort where we're going to look at the future of fill in the blank, and that's going to be the report, and then I'm going to assume people are going to read it. I need to immerse people, and they need to see what this looks like and feel what it looks like to believe in that value, to start to embed those as behaviors. That's what I think organizations need to do to start to make sure they're future ready. At very small scales, though, people just need time to imagine. Whether you have kids or other people that have like a different perspective, those moments of imagination are what we struggle. We might view it as problem solving, but like let's add a bit of a creativity to it. We need moments to imagine. And so this could be imagining a day, however many years in the future, imagining something that you would like to do and what would be that sort of possible. Because when we imagine something, we've already made the mental connections to somewhat recognize how this could be possible in some sort of way. And so I think we just don't take the time to just think imaginatively in many cases.
Okay, so speaking of taking the time, I would love to throw like a scenario at you where it's
Okay.
like for those who actually partner with leaders and executives, right? When you can actually get time with them,
Mm-hmm.
it's very precious. So I think
Yeah.
there are ways in which you can translate some of the ways of thinking or the principles of a futurist or foresight strategist
Mm-hmm.
into those conversations, right? So for those that actually have a passion and an inclination to do so that you can help the leader slow down to accelerate their success. Is there like a certain way of asking questions or a certain question that you kind of encourage them to utilize to create that space to slow down and think a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
imaginatively or whatever it may be?
Yeah, it's take something that they're not familiar with and try and relate it back to something that they're doing. So I've run innovation labs where we had zones that had various exponential technology. And what I would never do is introduce a technology from their own industry first. I would go, here's this automated digital pill container that can support your aging parent in taking the pills, and it's going to automatically send those sort of things. You're a mining client. And I go, based off of what you understood, what does this make you think of in your own industry? And start to imagine that to spark analogous thinking. So that's sort of one way. And then it's just assume that this is true, and if so, what might happen? And talk about the disruption in an element of like, not just what the risks would be. It's like, what would be the implications for this? What opportunities would this unlock for you? So like, we're really good at saying this would never happen, this would cause these issues, those sort of things. Really, I don't know, I'm not close enough to the psychology, but we're really good at cutting down an idea. But working with an idea, even the worst idea, is something that we don't often do regularly. There's actually, people can look up, there's a thinking wrong exercise where you actually generate the absolute worst idea to a problem, but you're forced to think through how that actually isn't a wrong idea. And it just activates different elements of your brain to start to think in possibilities and what value could be driven from it, even if it's the smallest thing that could relate to what you're doing.
I love that concept because I think it gives you permission to almost go into the messiness of whatever it is that you're trying to work through, right? And then it's less, I think, intrusive in some senses, right? Because when you're like, you have to come up with the best idea, right? Sometimes like people get attached to it, and then if it's like, oh, that's not actually the best idea, they have their walls up, right? And then it kind of dampens that creativity, right? But then you're like, if you come up with the worst idea, right, and then you talk through it and you're like, actually that might not actually be, right?
Exactly.
I think it almost depersonalizes it, right? And I think like the concept of slowing down to speed up is something that not everyone talks about. And even the whole concept of working 40 hours a week so that you can actually achieve objective is actually not that productive, right? So I'm curious, like for you, what are some trends that you're noticing when it comes to slowing down so that it can improve performance and decision making?
So you're seeing a lot on like digital detox, and it's been around for years. So it's not a weak signal. It is a trend of people disconnecting, and it's not just leaders, millennials, boomers, Gen X. It's really Gen Z also reckoning with the fact that they grew up with digital, they're digital native, and they're looking for ways to disconnect to it for many reasons. They're looking to start to break free from that overload. And there's a whole host of, technology enablement, the analog or the more brick phone that people are going back to, not a smartphone, but like a flip phone, those sort of things, to larger resorts and protocols and those sort of things in the world. And I believe it's Germany actually who had made regulations that leaders can't email outside of work hours. And so there's a range of things of people trying to take hold of their time in some sort of way. The other piece I think is when I look at elements like the gig economy and job stacking and people just reckoning with, do they want to work 40 hours a week to one organization, or are they looking to complement things and recognize that their life is like a ebbs and flows, that they're going to take off time for a sabbatical versus a vacation and those sort of things. People are reckoning with that, and COVID in a number of different pieces forced and put that into sort of a spotlight of people going, what are the reprioritization of some of my values to get to that point? And I myself work for one organization, but I still stack and complement with other things to sometimes work in a space that I consider a learning investment of my time because it's something new, it's different, and I can start to look at practical ways to integrate that into my own work. But I think people will look at, what does the employee look like? That's going to be redefined in the future. And if we say it's not going to be redefined, maybe it's not going to move as fast as we might have said 3 years ago. But as we say, like, think slow to be able to act or decide or move fast. There's also an element of things move really slow and then all of a sudden move really fast. And so you have to take that time, because when that inflection point hits, you don't want to be put on your heels in that situation.
Okay, I want to double click into that job stacking piece from an individual perspective, right? Because I have this thing that I go through. It's called like shiny object syndrome, right? I'm just like, I could learn from anything and everything. And then
Yes.
I'm like, oh my gosh, I just overwhelm myself and put way too much on my plate, right? So for you,
Mhm.
as you determine, okay, what else like can I add on? What else can what do I want to learn about? And how does this kind of play into like my bigger picture? How are you intentional about evaluating, okay, what is a shiny object moment versus nope, like this is part of me designing the lifestyle that I want so I can be
Mhm.
intentional and actually have space to breathe and not run around with my hair on fire all the time as
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So first off, I will say I'm not always the best. I've taken the long journey from FOMO to JOMO and the joy of missing out, but found ways to see or read or do things. So for me, priority over the years has really been recognizing like what do I really find interesting to myself that like it does not seem like work for me to dive into. And for me, that's an element of creative ideation and actioning on something in the space of if I'm working on like pricing chocolate bars, like every part of me is going to die, versus exploring the future because like I'm inherently looking to make an impact and change for many that is not centered around myself. So there's a lot of that soul searching that has to happen. Um, and I have a great family and kids that keep me in check. So am I missing out on something that is really important that I cannot regain? So in a lot of cases, I can take that job in the future. I can learn that thing in the future, but that activity with my daughter is not happening yet. So I have to prioritize a number of things. So it's not this work-life balance. It's just this hodgepodge. Like it's all mixed together. We're making a soup over time. Big thing that I find with prioritizing what I invest in, though, is that I've had to relinquish the thought that I need to know all of this and that it's a development effort that I get better when I add these layers. To me, it started to hit a point that it started to be diminishing returns in some areas because it was really confusing. I was learning interesting things. I was deep diving, but like when people wanted to know, well, what do you do and what do you focus on? And what is most passionate to you? It was hard because I had a list of 73 things that I wanted to share with them. Um, but this is where I think I've invested a lot in meeting amazing people, and a network. And to know where their level of expertise is, it gives me that ability to have impact and change and elevate in other people's work. But they're a network that I can ask about or better understand or invite me out for a day. I want to experience those sort of things. I think we think of this as a really individual piece of how we cultivate knowledge and learn and grow. Um, I rely on a lot of really interesting people to round out how I can do my work and my weird and wonderful knowledge base. I always say, like, I only need to know enough to be dangerous. And when I say dangerous, is to know when I need to engage you and really elevate you and put you on the podium for these sort of things and ask these questions. And so even learning about yourself or anyone, that's what I think is a lot of the power that we have is connecting around community and how do we use that in our own development.
I appreciate that. And that's kind of where I want to plug your network, Spracker
Mhm.
Collective, right? The fact that you are one of the people that are helping foster this community where you really can help elevate multiple people and shine light on their specific areas of expertise because of the rate in which information is changing and everything
For
is
sure.
evolving. To have people who are actually paying closely attention to that, I think it's the exchange of value and knowledge is so powerful there, right?
Mhm.
And then I kind of want to flip the view of that piece in terms of how can organizations prepare for the multiple plausible futures around the whole concept of job stacking and understanding that individuals aren't as likely to be investing 60 to 80 hours a week into that one role, but they do have these different areas to them. Yeah, like how can organizations prepare for this type of future?
So it's hard to overhaul from the start, but I love a metaphor. And so I go, how can we start to rethink of the employee relationship as less an arranged marriage and more about dating? And so when I think about dating, I did not grow up in the world of any sort of swipe right, swipe left. So I'm not going to root on that. But it's like you're looking for compatibility and intrigue and an excitement sort of thing. And then you're looking to match on some things. With dating, it's how do we start to work with people and on what they work best on? Maybe these start with projects that you date to a point that you are creating those milestones to have healthy conversations of, is this what you're interested in? How's it going for me? It's a project that we can do discreetly. Are we going to move forward? It could still progress to a level of marriage. But I think when we think of full-time employment, there's this feel around like you're on retainer. And so sometimes that's where I see a lot of people looking to work on a portfolio of things that align with many different elements of what they can do. And so that's where I think the dating relationship is important. The second piece is around how do you uncover things that might not have been what you hired for? And in my mind, it seems like a simple thing to question, but a lot of people I've run into have these magical superpowers that also could be deployed. But when we create this constraint of this is your job, this is your lane, this is what you're hired for, one, they might not bring that to work. So I'm not getting the value of that, but also I'm not creating and constructing projects. And so I think when I've done more job stacking, it's because I've had an element to myself as a facilitator. So I might not have been doing futures work, but I've been doing significant experience design and facilitation. So those were some of my projects, but I wanted an element of that. And then I had my deep dive into Foresight. And then maybe it was like an illustration piece, but like I wanted to have all of those priority elements to my work, but I wasn't going to get that from one organization. So asking yourself, how do we create more of a dating relationship versus an arranged marriage? And how do we bring all of the elements of that person to the job and integrate that into some of the work or the opportunities? To me, that starts to manage the transition a little bit more, and especially the dating side of things. I think probably your listeners have more numbers than I do around just the sheer length of time it is taking to find an employee. And in some cases, that's because we're looking for unicorns. Sometimes you're not going to find the PhD level sort of like optical vision machine learning, also with 10 years of significant communication and storytelling expertise, and they've been in branding and at a senior level. Like we're pulling from like the magnetic poetry of trying to pull together versus getting people in that you want to work with that are really strong and seeing how they do so that you can quickly orient to maybe like a different project or the right team. I'm really curious how we start to model that in organizations.
I appreciate that visual about that dating piece. And one thing I wanted to call out too is just like you need people who can figure shit out, right? Like instead of just trying to hire just for the unicorn that has every single checkbox, like perfect to the T kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like find people who meet a majority of that, but then their appetite to learn and figure it out will serve you so much more, right?
Yeah. What's
And
the
as we
70% higher? Like, what's the 70% higher with a lot of hunger?
Yeah. Because you can't teach hunger, right? And as we slowly wrap up our conversation, what do you think it takes to unleash the potential of individuals and organizations?
I think it's recognizing that they're humans. It's unfortunate that I have to say that in a lot of cases, but that we're not talking assets, we're not talking resources, that these are actually humans. To go back to the imagination side of things, people were talking about how are we moving from this industrial to this information, really heavily digital technology age. They say there's this woman that talks about sort of like the intelligent or the imagination bridge that comes to it, which becomes human. It's this level of creativity and sort of analogous thinking and the collaboration across that. And so to me, unlocking that power is recognizing that people are human, that there's many different mechanisms to it. And so how do we start to look from a human centric lens to it? And I've had to learn that over the years, but as you know, one recent game that we made that merged the world of foresight with leadership is Leaders for Humanity. And so it's really talking about how humans, and the feedback we've gotten was like, even though you're creating these sort of situations and scenarios that involve technology, those sort of things, you're really centering it back on where the human plays into it. And so that continues to sit in my brain, and that would be my challenge.
I appreciate that call out there. And my last question to you is what's one thing that's top of mind for you, whether it's you're excited about it or it's a way for people to better understand how they can potentially help you or partner with you?
Something that I'm thinking about is like, how do I get people to best feel what long-term or foresight feels like? And so we've been playing with this concept of how do we give immersive scenarios or experiences for people to see folks like myself in their element, and then be able to understand, one, how your company or organization becomes future ready, and us help you equip you become future ready. And so it's a lot of that priming, because I've been in many companies that I've been thrust in and they're just not ready. And it is an uphill battle, and likely a battle that is not going to be won. So I'm curious how we create those sort of experiences, discrete ones, for people to understand their appetite for being future ready and how we condition them to be future ready.
I'm excited to stay posted with how you continue to navigate that space. And Sabrina, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and your story. I really appreciate it. And to everyone else who's tuned into another episode, thank you so much for your time and attention. It means more to me than you'll know, and I can't wait to stay in touch with you on my next episode. Till then, stay safe.